Welcome. You're listening because you want to get to the heart of complex subjects, really understand how things connect, but without, wading through dense academic texts. Today, we're tackling something really significant, the impact of trauma. You've shared some great sources with us, and our mission here is to pull out the key insights. We're looking at how trauma hits us immediately, how it might incredibly pass through generations, how it reshapes the brain, and also exploring some approaches to healing.
Absolutely. It's a really compelling set of materials. We've got that anti-CABM article on the window of tolerance, which is foundational for understanding immediate reactions. Then there's a research paper delving into intergenerational trauma, specifically the epigenetics side, which is
Yeah.
fascinating, and another study using fMRI scans to see, the long-term footprint of different childhood traumas on the adult brain, plus a review of somatic experiencing, which takes a very body-focused approach to healing. So yeah, lots to dig into and connect for you.
Okay, great. Let's start with that window of tolerance. It sounds like a really practical concept for getting a handle on how we react under stress.
It really is. The NIKBM article paints it as like your optimal zone. When you're inside that window, you can handle emotions, stresses, life basically, but trauma or intense stress can push you outside it, either into uh, hyperarousal.
Right, the fight, flight, freeze thing, that feeling of being totally revved up.
Exactly. That's hyperarousal. Your nervous system is just on high alert, flooded with energy, even if the danger isn't right there anymore. You might feel agitated, thoughts racing, super jumpy. The article mentions triggers like, well, perceived threats, but also traumatic memories, even strong emotions can do it. It's a hallmark of PTSD.
Yeah, and understanding that it's this physiological overdrive, not just someone overreacting, that feels important.
It's crucial. It changes how you might support someone or even how you understand your own reactions. Self-compassion comes into it too.
Definitely. And the other side is hyperarousal. That sounds like the complete opposite.
Pretty much. It's a state of shutdown. The article describes it as feeling numb, zoned out, foggy, maybe even physically frozen. And again, the key is that it's involuntary. It's not someone choosing to check out.
It's like the system just hits the brakes when it's too much.
That's a good way to put it. It's often a protective mechanism when hyperarousal feels completely overwhelming. The body and mind try to create distance from the distress.
Okay, so this is where it gets really practical for therapy. The NICABMM piece talks about titration for hyperarousal. What does that mean exactly?
It means going slowly, taking things in really small doses. You don't want to overwhelm a system that's already overloaded. So the therapist helps the client touch on the difficult feelings or memories just a little bit at a time, helping them stay within or return to that window of tolerance.
Gently building capacity bit by bit makes sense.
Right. And for hyperarousal, or when someone is just flooded with emotion, they mention using body-oriented techniques, things to help recenter and ground the person.
Bringing awareness back to the physical self, like feeling your feet on the floor, maybe?
Exactly. Using physical sensations to anchor them in the present. And it was interesting, wasn't it, that comment from the physiotherapist?
Yeah, saying how this framework helps them understand and support their clients better. It shows how useful this concept is across different helping professions.
It really does. The window of tolerance gives a shared language, a way to understand and respond effectively to stress and trauma responses.
Okay, so that covers the immediate impact. Let's shift gears now to the longer-term picture, specifically that research on intergenerational transmission.
hmm
This feels, well, profound and pretty complicated.
It absolutely is. The whole idea that trauma's effects might not stop with the person who lived through it, but could ripple down to their children, maybe even grandchildren. It's a lot to take in. The paper starts by looking back at early observations, particularly with children of Holocaust survivors. Even when parents seemed outwardly functional, their kids sometimes showed really significant psychological issues.
I remember that quote from Redkoff in the paper, something like, it was almost easier to believe the children had been through the trauma themselves.
Yes, a very powerful observation. But the paper is careful here. It makes a distinction. Is it the direct biological impact of the parent's trauma? Or is it the child reacting to growing up with a traumatized parent? Or both? Early ideas focus more on the environment, maybe impaired parenting, neglect, that kind of thing. And studies did show that children of survivors often reported more childhood trauma themselves.
So the classic nature versus nurture question, but with this added layer of trauma.
Pretty much. And this is where the paper introduces the idea of non-genomic transmission, specifically epigenetics.
Okay, epigenetics. Can you break that down a bit? I was thinking of it like Software for our genes.
That's a great analogy. Your DNA sequence, the genes themselves, that's the hardware. Epigenetics is like the software instructions that tells the genes when to turn on, when to turn off, how strongly to express themselves. It involves these chemical tags that attach to the DNA or the proteins it's wrapped around. They don't change the underlying code, but they change how the code is read and used, often in response to environmental cues.
Got it. So experiences can leave these marks that affect how our genes work.
Precisely. And the paper discusses two main ways this might happen with intergenerational trauma. First, developmentally programmed effects. This relates to the offspring's early environment. So that includes things like the quality of care after birth, but also the environment in utero exposure to the mother's stress hormones during pregnancy, for example.
Okay, that makes sense. Environment shaping development.
Right. But the second category is even more striking. It suggests epigenetic changes might happen in the parents due to trauma before conception. Changes that could potentially affect their sperm or eggs, the germline. And these changes could then influence how the fetus develops, maybe even how the placenta functions. The idea that preconception experiences could have a biological echo in the next generation is, well, it's quite something.
It really is. The paper mentioned animal studies being helpful here.
Yes, because you can control the conditions much more easily. Animal models have provided some of the clearest evidence, like that classic study on rat mothers, how much they licked and groomed their pups, actually changed the DNA methylation patterns on stress-related genes in those pups.
Methylation, that's one of those epigenetic tags.
Exactly. It's like a chemical switch. And what was amazing was that if you took pups from low-licking mothers and had them raised by high-licking mothers, those epigenetic marks and the pup's stress responses actually changed.
Wow. So the early environment could actually override the initial programming in a way.
It showed a direct link between early caregiving and these lasting biological changes transmitted across generations. So yes, environment directly impacting gene expression.
Incredible. How does this translate to humans, though? The paper said it's more complex.
Much more complex. They mentioned studies looking at that same stress response gene, GR, in Holocaust offspring. They found different methylation patterns depending on whether it was the mother or the father who had PTSD. It suggests the mechanisms might be different depending on which parent was traumatized. It's not a simple inheritance pattern. And importantly, these epigenetic marks aren't necessarily set in stone for life. The paper emphasizes they can change throughout life based on experiences, including trauma experienced in adulthood.
That's a hopeful aspect, I guess,
Yeah.
that things can still change. What about the timing of trauma during pregnancy? The paper mentioned that was critical, too.
Hugely critical. They cited the study on mothers pregnant during 9/11. Infants whose mothers developed PTSD after being exposed in the third trimester had lower cortisol levels. And those famine studies, the Dutch hunger winter, the Swedish famines, showed that the health outcomes in children and even grandchildren depended heavily on when during gestation the nutritional stress occurred. It raises the possibility that the impact on the developing germ cells within the fetus could transmit effects to the next generation, too.
Mind-boggling, reaching across 2 generations. And is it the stress itself or the mother's psychological symptoms like anxiety during pregnancy that mediates this?
That's a key question the paper raises. It's likely an interplay. The mother's psychological state certainly influences the in utero hormonal environment, but there might be other direct biological signals, too. It's probably a mix.
And did they find differences between male and female offspring?
Yes, animal studies often show sex-specific effects, like prenatal stress sometimes leading to higher stress reactivity in male offspring. Some human studies also hint at differences in how the HPA axis, the main stress system, gets programmed, potentially leading to different cortisol patterns in males and females later on.
Okay, and what about the father's role? Can trauma experienced by fathers be passed on biologically?
The evidence suggests yes, potentially. The paper talks about epigenetic changes in sperm DNA methylation, changes to histones.
Histones, what are those?
Think of them like spools that DNA winds around. Changes to histones can affect how tightly the DNA is packed. Tightly packed DNA is harder to read, so the genes are less active. It's another layer of gene regulation. Animal studies show that stress or fear conditioning in fathers can lead to behavioral changes in their offspring, sometimes for multiple generations. And interestingly, things like environmental enrichment for the offspring could sometimes reverse these effects.
So again, not necessarily a fixed destiny.
Exactly. And those famine studies also showed some effects passing down the paternal line, possibly linked to sex chromosomes. It suggests that even environmental exposures that aren't extreme trauma might have lasting biological impacts transmitted via fathers.
So the takeaway here seems to be Evidence is mounting for biological transmission of trauma effects, likely via epigenetics, in humans. But it's incredibly complex, tangled up with environmental factors, parental behavior, still a lot to figure out.
That sums it up well. It's a really active area of research. We see strong signals, especially from animal work, but teasing apart the precise mechanisms and relative contributions in humans is challenging. But the idea that parental experiences leave a biological mark on offspring is gaining solid ground.
Okay, so we've looked at the immediate effects, the potential generational echoes. Now let's focus on the brain itself with that third source. The fMRI study on childhood trauma's impact on adult brain function.
Right. This study took a different approach, using resting state fMRI, looking at brain activity when people aren't doing a specific task to map connectivity patterns. They specifically looked at different types of childhood trauma: emotional abuse and neglect, physical abuse and neglect, and sexual abuse, and how these related to brain network connections in adults.
And the overall finding first.
A clear link between experiencing any type of childhood trauma and increased symptoms of depression and anxiety in adulthood. That came through strongly.
Okay, that aligns with what we generally know. But the real novelty was looking at the specific trauma types, right? What did they find there?
They did find distinct patterns. For childhood neglect, they saw associations with network transmission efficiency, basically how well different brain areas communicate in regions involved in thinking, self-awareness, memory, places like the temporal lobe, insula, parahippocampal gyrus.
So neglect might alter how these key cognitive hubs talk to each other.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Whereas for childhood abuse, the links were more towards functional changes in regions related to, how they put it, immature ego defense systems and damaged emotion representation. Specifically, they saw increased network efficiency in sensory areas, visual, auditory, motor cortex, and also more sort of isolated communication patterns within parts of the temporal cortex and supplementary motor area, regions linked to emotion and movement planning, particularly with emotional and physical abuse.
It's really striking how different types of adversity seem to leave these different neurobiological signatures. As the study pointed out, that's a big step beyond just lumping all trauma together.
Exactly. Using an aggregated score can mask these specific effects. By looking at subtypes, we get a much finer-grained picture of how early experiences sculpt the brain's functional architecture long-term. They used complex graph analysis methods to map all this out.
And presumably, these specific alterations in brain connectivity could help explain why different types of trauma might lead to different kinds of psychological difficulties later on.
That's the connection, yes. It provides a potential neural basis for the varied long-term outcomes we see. It bridges the gap between the early experience and the adult psychological profile. So yeah, different adversities, different brain fingerprints, potentially leading to different challenges.
Right. Okay, so we've covered immediate, generational, and neurological impacts. Let's shift to healing with our final source, the review of somatic experiencing. This sounds like a very different approach from typical talk therapy.
It is quite different. SE is what's called a bottom-up therapy. Instead of starting with thoughts and cognitions, it starts with the body, the physical sensations. The core idea is that trauma leaves a residue in the nervous system, affecting both mind and body, and healing involves working directly with that physiological aspect.
The review mentioned that cognitive approaches don't work for everyone, and sometimes things like exposure therapy can be overwhelming or lead to high dropout rates. So SE offers an alternative path.
That's the premise. The SE model suggests PTSD symptoms often stem from the body's natural defensive responses, like fight, flight, or especially freeze, getting stuck or incomplete during the traumatic event. The nervous system stays on high alert. So the main goal in SE is to help the nervous system renegotiate and complete those responses, calming that overactive stress system, primarily by focusing attention on internal physical sensations.
So rather than analyzing the trauma story in detail, the focus is on what's happening in the body right now, like noticing tightness or heat or trembling. Is that the interoception thing again?
Exactly. Interoception awareness of inner body states is key. And also proprioception, the sense of your body in space. The therapist guides the client to gently notice these sensations, learning to tolerate them in small amounts, building capacity, and finding resources, both internal feelings of strength or calm and external supports that feel grounding.
The review talked about a discharge process. What's that about?
That refers to the idea that the trapped survival energy needs a way to release. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be very subtle, maybe slight trembling, a deep breath, a feeling of warmth or tingling, small involuntary movements. It's seen as the nervous system letting go of that pent-up activation. A key point is that SE tries to avoid re-traumatization by not having the person relive the whole event intensely, unlike some exposure therapies.
Huh.
It's much more gradual and titrated.
So it's about gently helping the body find its way out of that stuck stress response, creating new, safer physical experiences linked to the trauma memory.
That's a good way to phrase it, renegotiating the response through new interoceptive experiences. And the review notes that while it was developed for trauma, it's being used more broadly now for things like anxiety or stress regulation because it helps people connect with and regulate their nervous system.
Okay, but does it work? What did the research review actually find about its effectiveness?
The review found, well, promising preliminary evidence. Several studies, including some non-randomized ones and a few randomized controlled trials, RCTs, showed significant reductions in PTSD symptoms after SE. And often, these improvements seem to hold up over time in follow-up checks. Encouragingly, the studies with stronger methodologies, like the RCTs with active control groups, tended to show the most positive results for PTSD.
That is encouraging. Did they find effects beyond PTSD symptoms?
Yes, some studies also reported improvements in related issues like depression, anxiety, overall quality of life, and even physical symptoms that often accompany trauma. So potentially broader benefits.
But there were limitations noted in the research, right?
Oh, absolutely. The review was clear about that. The overall number of high-quality studies is still quite limited. The studies that exist are pretty varied in terms of design, who they studied, how they measured things, and the risk of bias across the studies was mixed. So the big takeaway is that we need more rigorous, large-scale RCTs to really confirm SE's effectiveness and understand it better.
And did the review shed light on how SE might work? What are the active ingredients?
It pointed to a few key factors based on the existing literature. The focus on body sensations, obviously, but also fostering affect regulation skills, and the importance of the therapeutic relationship itself. However, they also mentioned that research specifically testing these mechanisms is still scarce and the findings aren't entirely consistent yet.
Okay, so somatic experiencing looks like a promising avenue, especially focusing on the body's role, but more robust research is definitely needed to solidify its place and understand exactly how it helps.
Precisely. It's a valuable addition to the therapeutic landscape, offering a different entry point for healing, but the science is still catching up to fully map out its effects and mechanisms.
Well, this has been quite the exploration. We've journeyed from the immediate jolt of trauma via the window of tolerance to its potential echoes across generations through epigenetics, peered into the brain changes left by childhood adversity, and considered a body-up approach like somatic experiencing for healing.
Yeah, and if there's one thread connecting all this, it's the sheer complexity and the deep mind-body integration of trauma's impact. It's not just in your head. It fundamentally alters our nervous system, our biology, potentially even the biological legacy we pass on. Understanding both the psychological and the physiological pieces feels absolutely essential for moving forward. And while areas like epigenetics and these body-focused therapies are still developing fields, they really do open up exciting possibilities for more holistic understanding and treatment.
It leaves you thinking, doesn't it? When we see this deep interconnectedness, our biology, our experiences, maybe even inherited stress responses, what new avenues for healing and well-being might open up as we keep digging deeper. It's a compelling thought about the intricate weave of human experience and resilience, something to really mull over.